Hello, everyone that is tuned in for our last enology session of the day. I'm Jenny Savitz. I'm moderating here from the Midwest Grape and Wine Industry Institute. Thanks for joining us again at this virtual Iowa Specialty Producers Conference. Our titles of our session this afternoon with Luke Holcomb is Pet Nat and Piquette Production Roulette. So I love the rhyminess, and I'm really excited to learn about these two styles because I don't know a whole lot about them. So I think it'll be fascinating. But before I introduce Luke, a couple of announcements that you probably know by heart after being on here for 2 days. But I am recording the session, I believe, I hope. Yep. And so your continued participation is your consent. Your mics are all muted, your videos are off. It should remain this way during the presentation. So thank you for that. And we will do Q&A following the session, so type any questions in the chat box as we go, as you think of them, so you don't forget, and then we'll go back through them at the end of the presentation. So now for our speaker. Luke Holcomb really doesn't need an introduction, but I'll go ahead and give you one. He is owner and operator of Black Dog Consulting, working as a beverage science consultant. He has 21 years of industry experience in multiple regions, making tens of millions of gallons of beverage, has technical sales experience in wine and adjacent products. He's written articles, protocols, and has taught college courses. He brings a unique perspective to beverage science and believes that winemaking is often overcomplicated and that consistent, high-quality products should be the standard. And if you listen to our conversation, he is a proud dad dog of Mr. Wilson and Luna and Sadie and lots of pups. So thank you, Luke, and I will now give you the floor.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. This is a little easier travel schedule to all of these conferences because I can do it from my office instead of flying all over the country like I used to. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully this is somewhat illuminating, or I don't know, sometimes it can be educational. That's the goal. Sometimes it goes a little beyond that, but let's get into this. So the theme is kind of the 90s, which is blast from the past, which is indicative of Pet Nat and Piquette. These are not new products. They've been around for a long time, and we will talk about that. So first slide is going to be about me with some pedigree information. It will be again at the end of the presentation. I'm going to try to blow through these. I got about 22 slides with a lot of information. So I talk fast. I apologize for that on the front end, but hopefully this will be recorded and I might just throw it out there on my podcast. We'll see what happens. So let's dive in. Let me get this over here. Okay. So about me, the biography there that Jenny gave was self-explanatory. I'm the owner, CEO, head admin guy, biller, accounts payable, accounts receivable for Black Dog Consulting. What makes us quite a bit different is while my ego is plenty big, I decided to involve other people in my consulting firm. So when a customer engages with Black Dog Consulting, you not only get my expertise and my opinion, but also you have other people looking at the problem or the situation or the project apart from just me. So it's kind of a crowdsource approach because there's a lot of things I don't know, and I rely on other people to help me with that. Model is no cost to the client partner, meaning so long as you work with us and work through our preferred vendor network, the preferred vendors share a portion of the proceeds with us, and that's how we get compensated. So it's really kind of an interesting model, almost a pyramid scheme, but not quite. But there's my Instagram, Black Dog Consulting Wine, and bdwineconsulting@gmail.com. Between Two Buds is my new podcast. I think this industry is ripe for some new media types. So I'm getting out there with Between Two Buds. If you know Zach Galifianakis's Between Two Ferns, it's a play off of that, along with Budding Yeast and all of that sort of thing. So check your feelings at the door. We might offend some people. That's actually kind of the point. So between two buds podcast at gmail.com, there's the link for the first episode 2 and 3 are inbound. I'm just editing them right now. Piquette Posse is an Instagram page that I run, which is focused on Piquette. So maybe that's why I've got the honor to give this presentation. So Pet Nat natural, the ancestral method. So this was an accident. So in the 17th century, in France, the temperatures in that area a lot of times caused the fermentation to stop during the wintertime, and then it would kick back up in the springtime. Well, there were some people that bottled it up and shipped it allegedly on a boat over to England. And by the time it got over there, it had re-fermented in the bottle and created, Pet Nat essentially. And the English told the French, my goodness, send us some more of this yummy, bubbly stuff. And the French said, well, we don't make any of that. What are you talking about? And through a couple hundred years of research and trials and testing, they kind of realized what was going on. And then by the 19th century, they actually developed method champenois, which is a more controllable, repeatable process for making bubbles intentionally, whereas Pet Nat was somewhat of an accident and can be considered something similar to roulette because of the complexity in capturing it at the right time in order to bottle it. So that's the old history. The new history is it's a reemergence of the style born out of the natural wine movement. And it's a low-tech way to make bubbles. Low-tech, low cost, the labor is kind of high, and really Pet Nats can be all over the board on quality, on bubble formation and dryness and all sorts of things, but similar to bottle conditioning in beer. If you look at the little picture there, that's kind of what I think a lot of people in natural wine world expect out of Pet Nat. Cloudy, no added yeast, no added sugar, natural production, fermentation in the bottle. It's affordable, funky aromatics, things like that. So I think the acceptable quality and the things that you're willing to accept as a consumer should be a little bit greater than if you're just going to buy a bottle of champagne or sparkling wine. You expect consistency, whereas Pet Nat is a little bit more open. Let's talk about Piquette real quick. This dates back to Greek and Roman times. It's low alcohol, it's cheap, commonly given to slaves and field workers back in the day. It's illegal in France. It comes from the French word for prick or prickle, like on your tongue, because it's a little frizzante style. And actually, where it really met its apex in history was as part of compensation for being a vineyard or cellar worker. The owner of the winery has to pay their cellar workers partly in wine. And so instead of giving them the full strength stuff, they would wash the grape skins and ferment the rest of the stuff out. And that was Piquette, and that's what they paid their field workers. And eventually, people got wind of that and outlawed Piquette. So the new history is, it again comes from the natural wine movement, and it's really a profit maximizing wine alternative to seltzer. I think it's the wine industry's best alternative to seltzer and the best answer. So this is right here is Old Westminster Winery in Maryland. It's one of my favorite Piquettes. I think it is probably the gold standard in Piquettes. I would recommend the one in the can, not in the bottle. I like the one in the can a lot better. So if you want a good example, that's what I would recommend to set kind of a baseline for what you would try to achieve with Piquette. So let's talk real quick about Pet Nat. So the challenges in producing Pet Nat essentially is this. So bottles exploding. That is a big issue. And we're going to address how to prevent some of that. And really it is knowing what you're doing and understanding some of the chemistry and what can happen. So we're going to dive into that. So bottle explosions. So your priming sugar, which is with Pet Nat, you're trying to catch the fermentation right at the right point in order to bottle it and let it finish off in the bottle, create the carbonation and end the fermentation. If you do not have a handle on your actual residual sugar if you're relying on a density measurement or a hydrometer, your bottle explosions are probably going to be much more common than if you do a little bit more analysis. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. If it's uncontrolled and you're relying on a hydrometer or taste to identify the amount of residual sugar, there's a large liability and risk factor there that can cause the bottles to explode. Ideally, it just pushes the cork or pops the crown cap, but that is not always the case. Gushing is another big problem. What happens is if it's not disgorged, the lees can create nucleation points for the carbon dioxide and cause, well, something similar to what's being displayed on the screen. But that is a fun way, when intentional, to enjoy a bottle of bubbles. But when you're in your kitchen and you're popping a bottle of Pet Nat and it does this unwantedly, that can lead to some unhappy customers when half the bottle or 3/4 of the bottle ends up as foam all over their kitchen counter and floor. So we're going to try to navigate those pitfalls. Also, stuck fermentations. There are synergistic stressors at this point in the fermentation. You have relatively high alcohol, probably in the 10% range, and your pH is probably pretty low because you're going to want to pick a wine that's got a low pH and high acidity in order to emulate sparkling wine. Also, pressure can be a stressor. So as the fermentation progresses in the bottle and the pressure increases, that is actually a stressor for the yeast and other microorganisms. The sugar ratio, whether it's glucose, fructose 50-50, or if it's mostly fructose, that can be of huge concern depending on the yeast strain that is conducting the fermentation, whether or not you selected for that yeast strain or if it's indigenous. Contamination, also a huge thing, because you're just taking that white wine fermentation, mixing it all up and bottling it. You don't know what else was in there. So it's really imperative, like with any winemaking endeavor, to start with super clean fruit and maybe do something on the juice stage to reduce bacterial load and some of the native yeast. Also can be a nutrient deficiency. At this tail end of the fermentation, there may not be a lot for the yeast to, apart from carbon sources, may not be enough for them to complete the fermentation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can do this naturally with whatever yeast come in off of the vineyard, or you can actually choose a fructophilic yeast, is what I would most likely recommend. And a fructophilic has the ability to metabolize fructose a lot easier than other Saccharomyces strains. So if you do choose to implant a strain and your goal is Pet Nat, I would contact your supplier or contact me, and I can work with you to identify a good fructophilic, low nutrient demand yeast to conduct not only the primary, but also the bottle conditioning for Pet Nat. Potentially, you could also use encapsulated yeast. That's kind of a rabbit hole there, but encapsulated yeast makes riddling very easy, and riddling and disgorgement is sometimes used in Pet Nat. It's almost always used in traditional method. But essentially, riddling, once the fermentation is done, you put them on the riddling racks and you go through and over time slowly get the lees to end up towards the cap in the neck of the bottle. Then you freeze that cap and that plug of yeast and you disgorge. And if you go to my Instagram at the Deliberate Winemaker, there's a video of Tony up in Michigan showing how to properly disgorge. So encapsulated yeast, you don't have to go through that long-term riddling process. You just literally turn the bottle over and all the yeast drop to the neck of the bottle and you can disgorge right there. It's a lot easier, but you really have to be careful with contamination, because if you do get any other yeast in there and you're using encapsulated yeast, you still have to riddle. So you have to be very careful. Also, one of the things you may want to look at, and I would suggest this for any winery anywhere in the world, I think you should have a hemocytometer and cell counting capability, a microscope, and this picture on the right-hand side of the screen shows what a hemocytometer looks like. What you're doing there is identifying how many colony forming units per 100 mils there is, and that will give you an idea before you go into the bottle for Pet Nat whether you have a decent population to finish off that fermentation. It's viability, so you can kind of see if they're wiggling about and doing their thing. That does not give you an idea of their vitality. So it's still just a generalized measure, but it's very common in brewing world. So if you're looking into Pet Nat and Piquette, I would highly recommend engaging with your favorite brewer to kind of help you along, because this is in kind of another region of beverage science that the brewers, I think, have a better handle on than the average winemaker, in my opinion. You may want to cold stabilize, maybe crash the juice before you start fermentation to try to drop some of those tartrates out, and maybe even a mid fermentation cold crash. Because if you get tartrate formation at the end of fermentation in the bottle and you go to pop open that Pet Nat, those crystals can become nucleation points for the CO2, and again you get that gushing issue. So the gushing issue is really twofold, partially threefold. Number one, you have the lees acting as nucleation points. This is why I would recommend disgorging. Secondly would be if you have any tartrate formation, those will radically increase your rates of gushing. And the third would be just general CO2 solubility. It is not simply a pressure and temperature equation, although people would like it to be. There's also a protective barrier in the form of manoproteins and some other things that cause the mousse, the foam, to be adequate, and bubble retention is maintained and encouraged. And if you over refine your juice, you can have really unstable CO2. So that's another thing. Fermentation kinetics. So the whole idea is to capture this Pet Nat, somewhere in the neighborhood of, 11 grams per liter, maybe even higher, depending on what you're going for. Common priming sugars for a second fermentation with traditional method Champenois production is 24 grams per liter. That accounts for a little bit of disgorging pressure loss. So what you're trying to do is you slowly try to cool the fermentation down and get it to that exact point where the right amount of priming sugars is in there and you can bottle it up. You can control this by very slowly, as you, in the days preceding that end point, you can start slowing the fermentation down by increasing the glycol that's delivered to the tank and chilling it down. If you try to drastically change the temperature over a short period of time, you will most likely run into hydrogen sulfide issues and potentially stuck fermentations because you have angered the yeast. Whereas if you slowly start dialing the temperature down in preparation for bottling, you can do a much better job at preventing that hydrogen sulfide production and stressing the yeast. I also recommend for any fermentation, red, white, rosé, sparkling, doesn't matter, monitor and adjust the brix and the temperature on a daily basis. I'm a fan of looking at sugar depletion over time instead of, it takes 5 days for me to do a fermentation. I don't care if it takes me 15, 20, 45 days. I look for a very slow fermentation when it comes to whites and rosés, typically under a brick a day, and I adjust the temperature of the fermenter in order to achieve that. It does require a pretty robust yeast strain, so bear that in mind. It's also really important to analyze the initial yeast assimilable nitrogen. I prefer enzymatic tests for this, and you may want to supplement. I prefer organic nutrition, and that's a whole nother topic there. But if you use a yeast or the yeast that's indigenous uses a lot of nitrogen, well, there may not be enough to finish out the fermentation, and the yeast may not be healthy enough. So even if you have adequate nutrition on the front end, you may still want to supplement with an organic yeast nutrient additive in order to give the micronutrients and the minerals and the vitamins, amino acids, everything like that the yeast are going to need. So you have to balance your fermentation conditions with your initial YAN, and then also what sort of profile of nutrition you're going to use. So yeast vary in their need of nitrogen and what forms of nitrogen. And so it's kind of that's a whole nother topic all in of itself. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. And there's your hemocytometer spinning around for you. And this is an idea of a fermentation curve. You have a stationary phase and then log phase, and this is your peak biomass. And what I'm talking about insofar as your fermentation kinetics, if you can, for lack of a better term, flatten the curve, take this slope and increase it out and make it a slower curve, you can catch that ideal time to bottle a lot better. So that's where you use your refrigeration to extend that curve. And there you go. So more problem mitigation. So one of the things that you need to do, in my opinion, so you're going to have a certain amount of priming sugar that's going to create a certain amount of dissolved CO2, but throughout the fermentation, that CO2 is produced, and so you're probably at solubility of carbon dioxide on your fermenter. So what I recommend is, because you're going to want to mix the tank anyways with Pet Nat to make sure you're not stratified. So that way, if you start bottling out of that tank, your first stuff may be a lot higher sugar than the top of the tank. And even in a tank that is rolling under fermentation, there still can be some pretty drastic stratification. So I think it's really good to mix the tank before you make the call to bottle it. And you can do so using nitrogen gas. And I've talked about that a million times, about using nitrogen gas, not only for mixing, but to scrub dissolved gases, primarily dissolved oxygen. But you can also use it to scrub the CO2. And what you're doing, you're going to try to zero out that carbon dioxide number so it's as close to zero as possible. And then your priming sugar is going to be what creates the CO2 in the bottle. So if you don't scrub the CO2, you're going to have some quantity of CO2 that's going to be coming from the liquid, and then you're going to have that which is produced from the priming sugar. And sometimes that can cause bottles to break because you're not accounting for the total amount of CO2 and thereby the pressure in the bottle that is eventually going to be exuded upon the package. You should really know your glucose fructose. Again, this is an enzymatic analysis. If you're relying on a densiometer or a hydrometer to identify your soluble solids, it's taking into account other things beyond the priming sugars, which would be glucose and fructose. So you might say, yeah, I'm 11 grams per liter or 1% sugar, or whatever you may be. That's really not an accurate way to identify how much reducing sugars or fermentable sugars are in solution, and thereby not a very good way to understand how much CO2 is going to be produced, which is going to correlate to how much pressure is in the bottle. So remove your CO2 and identify your glucose fructose. I think it's a good idea to go ahead and riddle and disgorge the lees prior to release. So once you get your pressure in the bottle and the fermentation is finished, you can move to riddling and disgorging, and that will help reduce the gushing potential. And it makes just a kind of a nicer product for the consumer. It's a lot less hazy, a little clearer. So I would generally recommend that. And for sure, always use a sparkling rated bottle enclosure. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But with anything related to bubbles and carbonation, make sure your pumps, your hoses, your filter housings, your tanks, anything that's going to see the pressure are rated for gas pressure, not liquid pressure. When you have carbonation in the system, you must have equipment that is rated for gas pressure. People die every year across the world because they do not use gas pressure rated equipment, specifically lenticular and cartridge housings. So you need to make sure it's gas pressure rated. Most of the equipment that's out there on the market is not. It's usually a special order item. So when you start looking at Charmant or Pet Nat or anything where you're going to be transferring and filtering and manipulating sparkling products, make sure it's gas pressure rated. And always wear your personal protective equipment, gloves, safety glasses, all that sort of thing, because if you do get a bottle explode, it can cause some serious issues. So, 6 bar, 7 bar of pressure in a bottle with traditional sparkling wine you have a bomb on your hands. And depending on level of priming sugar going into the bottle with your Pet Nat, you can have the same kind of thing. So they're just ready to pop. So be very careful with that. And there's your glucose and fructose. And there's what a Ritalin rack looks like if you haven't seen one before. So that's a brief introduction on Pet Nat and some of the things to look at there. Here's Piquette. We'll move on to Piquette real quick, and we'll circle back on some of the packaging things towards the end and get into a Q&A. This is from the Austin Winery in Austin, Texas. They were one of the on the forefront of Piquette, and I think they do a great job. And incidentally, their artwork matches the artwork of my presentation, which I love, that little throwback 90s retro stuff. So what is Piquette? Well, very simply, you take water and you add it to pressed off grape skins, and then something happens like fermentation involving yeast, and then you get this stuff, this bubbly, yummy, lovely, refreshing, low alcohol spritzer. Now, some people choose to use enological additives along the way to adjust chemistry, acidulation, maybe some priming sugars if you missed your window, nutrients, tannins, yeast, maybe. You can go full natural or you can go full commercial. Just depends on what your goals are and what your philosophy is. But pow, you want that awesome stuff in the bottle. That's Fence Style Winery out of Kansas City, Missouri. I helped them with their Piquette, and they're getting some great reviews. And also, there was a recent Wine Business Monthly hot brand, I believe, last year with High Meadow Winery in High Texas, and I helped them with their Piquette. So if you have questions about Piquette, I guess I'm the guy. So best case, you get a light, refreshing, upcycled, green all the things, sustainable, crisp, grape-based spritzer. And you can have some significantly high margins with these things because it's nothing for a 350 or a 275 to be $5-6, and your cost of goods be in the less than $1 range. So it's a really great way to maximize your profit, and that would be your yum yum. Worst case is you get a light, sour, acidic, maybe full of VA, bitter, spoiled Piquette. And that's, I would say, generally speaking, that's more the norm than the best case, because if you take a standard winemaking protocol handling what you think or what is common in the industry on handling wine, and you apply it to Piquette, it will behave badly because it's closer to beer and cider than it is wine. So you might just get Piquette Le Pew, and there he is right there. Piquette in French is nearly a curse word. So if you ask a French person, "Ooh, I got this great Piquette," you just about curse them out. They don't want anything to do with it because it is a bad word in French. So just FYI. So Piquette Roulette. Just like Pet Nat with its eccentricities, I think Piquette is a similar way, maybe even harder because of the lower alcohol and some of the other points that we'll delineate in this next slide. So you have low alcohol, typically 5 to 7% ABV is common. You have a higher than normal wine pH. So, typically wine pHs are in the 3 to 4, but because you're adding so much water to the grape skins and to the marc, to the pumice, the vast majority of the product is actually water. And so depending on your water source and your water chemistry, you can have some higher pHs, which opens the gates on spoilage organisms. So you have to be very careful there. Maybe that's where you want to do an acid add, but you've got to balance that with the flavors and all that. Your water chemistry, hardness, sterility, pH, your metals, minerals, fluoride, chlorine, and then THMs or trihalomethanes, which come from the breakdown of the chlorine and fluoride. Those are all serious concerns, and a brewer takes all those things into account. And I wish that more wineries would look more closely at their water chemistry and especially their sterility, because you can get a lot of spoilage organisms coming in from the well or from your municipal system. Plus, you're going to get those lovely additives that they think we need, such as fluoride and chlorine, and then the byproducts trihalomethanes. So you should in my estimation, you should really treat your water. You have an unknown microbial population with this, depending if you're going full natural or a little commercial. Whenever you take this Piquette, you don't really know what you're putting in the bottle. And so, maybe you want to do some turbidity measurement, maybe some microscopy to determine what you have in there. Maybe even send it out for a scorpion, to analyze what sort of populations you have. But this is one of the other reasons why it's kind of a roulette. And you also have a questionable starting brick. So if you get your pressed off grape skins and then you add water to it, what happens is, after about a couple hours, you're going to get some starting bricks. Overnight, your bricks are going to be maybe quite a bit different because you're essentially rehydrating raisins. And so it takes time to integrate all the sugar that's left over in the skins. And you also have fermentation progressing. So your bricks are going down, but there's more sugar coming in as the grapes are being rehydrated. So it's kind of a moving target there. So you got to be careful. And I've heard a lot of people that wanted a 5% Piquette and ended up with a 10% Piquette, which is probably not going to be very palatable. It's going to just taste like rocket fuel. So that's just something to be aware of, especially in addition, if you use, fruit like Zinfandel or anything that has a propensity to raisining, you will find that you might be at 25 bricks, and then overnight, even with the fermentation progressing, you'll soak up to 27. So it's something to be wary of. And thank you, Archer. With Piquette, you are in the danger zone. This is not like making still wine. Please don't approach it like a still wine. Please approach it like a beer or cider. And I think you'll be much better off. You have to be much cleaner, much more deliberate, careful, and dissolved gases, especially oxygen, are going to hit this a lot harder, and your Acetobacter and other spoilage organisms are going to have a lot easier time in your Piquette than they will in a full strength wine with a lower pH and tannins and higher alcohols. So please be very careful. The nice part about this is, because most of this is water and you're using your spent grape skins, well, the cost of goods is pretty low. So if you do have a bad batch, dump it, try it again the next time, learn from the mistakes. So the rules of Piquette Roulette. Here's kind of an idea. This is not a prescription. I do not endorse this. This is just something I kind of threw together to give you an idea of some of the things that you should be looking at and be concerned with when making a Piquette. You want to identify your potential alcohol. So your potential alcohol is your starting bricks multiplied by something in the neighborhood of 0.55 to 0.62, and that's your potential alcohol. Now, with the rehydration issue, sometimes that's a moving target. But generally speaking, if you had a stable bricks reading, somewhere around 3.17 bricks is about right to produce that which you want. Again, it depends on what your potential alcohol target is. I like to see pHs below 3.55. You may want to make a target addition of citric malic or tartaric. Depending on your water source, it can be quite a bit higher than that. So if you do just make a blanket add to hit a pH, your TA may be really high and it might be really sour. So you kind of have to balance that safety and security that you get with pH, but then also the palate impact of a high TA. So glucose, fructose, again, for a common sparkling wine, you're in the 6-7 bar range. If you hit 3 to 3.75 with half of that priming sugar, you're still going to be very bubbly and you're still going to be above the tax break. So maybe you want to try to get closer to 1800 ppm of dissolved CO2. That gets you underneath that number, and you can reference the 27 CFR to try to identify where that tax break is. Water chemistry, I talked about. Consult your local brewer. If you want a great book, I would recommend The Practical Brewer. I think the brewing industry is light years ahead of the winemaking industry on their resources that are available to them. And it makes sense because beer's harder to make, in my opinion, than wine is. So check that out. If you have any questions, let me know. Cell counts, again, you may want to make sure that you have a healthy population that's going to finish off the Piquette in the package. Now, what you could do with Piquette, you could ferment it all the way to dryness, and then carbonate it and then package it. So that's another way to do it. But I think most people are doing some sort of bottle conditioning similar to Pet Nat. So with the higher than wine pHs, low alcohol, difficult fermentation conditions, Piquette production is much closer to beer and cider conditions and should be treated as such. Using the same sanitation production techniques as wine will likely lead to problems. In traveling the United States over the past few years and tasting wines from anywhere from California to Michigan down to Texas, there's still a long way to go in combating oxidation, and please feel free to Google my name and dissolved oxygen, and you will find all that you need to know about dissolved oxygen mitigation. It is the number 1 problem in the wine industry worldwide. And it's unfortunate that in 2021, I think the industry as a whole still doesn't have a good handle on it. And the problem is exacerbated with lighter style wines like whites, rosés, Piquette, Pet Nat, and also smaller batch sizes. So if you're a smaller winery, the deck is stacked against you, and you need to be much more careful with that. And I would recommend talking to a brewer on how they approach dissolved oxygen, because they have typically a very good handle on it compared to wineries. So bottle conditioning, this goes for Pet Nat or Piquette or anything you want to do. It consumes the dissolved oxygen, and so it will naturally carbonate. And so it enhances the shelf life because you don't have that oxidation in there to degrade your wine, and you can really have some pretty good shelf life. Lees is a natural preservative. A lot of the products that are coming on the market are derived from yeast cells, and one of the compounds that is an antioxidant and protective is glutathione. And I think people have known this for a long time. If you have good, healthy lees and you keep your wine on the lees, it just lasts longer. So that's one of the benefits to bottle conditioning. Now, if you have too much CO2 and too much lees, you do get that gushing issue that can occur in Piquette as well as Pet Nat. Sensory improvement. So as the autolysis process proceeds with the lees, and the yeast start breaking down and releasing their intercellular contents, and their cell wall gets ripped open, a lot of manoproteins and flavor compounds and that umaminess and that creaminess, brioche-ness that comes through. So it can kind of take the edge off in an acidic, maybe bitter and astringent wine. So that's one of the other benefits to bottle conditioning. But you do have an unknown microbial population. So you may finish off and get a good, nice product, and then after things have settled down, maybe Brettanomyces will kick off, maybe some bacterial issues depending on your chemistry and all of that. So there are ways to help select for a healthy microbial population, primarily Saccharomyces, and it has to do with some good racking techniques and getting the light and fluffy lees into the bottle, as opposed to the big, heavy, chunky stuff at the bottom, which has been trapped under hydraulic pressure. And that's where a lot of the bacteria and the spoilage organisms like to hang out. So if I were to make a Piquette, I would probably make a good racking, but still leave just enough of that fluffy lees in there to provide the yeast necessary. So packaging for carbonation. Here's a quick overview of the different package types and whether or not they are compatible with carbonation. So kegs, as we all know, beer's in it. Yes, they can do carbonation depending on the keg, up to 120, 130 PSI. So you can do full sparkling in there. Cork and wire hood. Yes, you can do carbonation, as we know. Cans, yes, and we'll get into that a little bit more. They do have a pressure limit, so full sparkling is probably not, but a half sparkling, quarter sparkling, yeah, I would say so. Screw caps, you can find liners and caps that will work for carbonation. The Saranex and tin usually have a 1 bar limit, and the high pressure liner, which I'll show you here in a minute, usually has a 6 bar, but check with your supplier. Crown caps, again, those are usually used for entourage aging and secondary fermentation of champagne. So absolutely they can do carbonation. Again, I guess I have cans in there twice. I guess I'm a big can fan. I don't know. Insertable closures like 1+1s or natural corks or agglomerates or synthetics, really less than 1,400 parts per million. And 1,400 is just barely enough to give you some of that spritz on the tongue. You probably want something higher than that. So I would not generally recommend a standard cork for these products, especially not Pet Nat. Bag in the box, no carbonation, can't do it. You'll end up with a basketball of a bag. So pressure capable closures, you've got crown caps. There are different sizes of crown caps, and they are not interchangeable. And wine crown caps are different than beer crown caps. And there are various liner choices depending on how long you want to age it. So some of the longer aged Pet Nats and traditional sparklings use a very low oxygen transmission liner. Some of them use a faster transmission in order to get the wine more ready for market. There are a decent amount of color options out there, and you can talk to your various suppliers on who has those. So that's an option. You can get custom crown caps if you want to get fancy, but usually the minimum order quantity is about 100,000 just with screw caps and everything else. So wine crown caps do require a heavy duty applicator. So if you have one from your beer brewing days in college, it will not work for wine crown caps. So please go get the right one. But as you can see here with this crown cap, it can actually be a pretty elegant, classy looking closure. So I wouldn't write it off. Cork and wire hood. So most corks and most wire hoods out there are designed for full sparkling. So 6-7 bar pressure. And so if you're using a Pet Nat or a Piquette with a much lower carbonation than sparkling wine, you can have some really difficult issues getting the corks out. So that, with a common sparkling wine, if you take the wire hood off and wait, the cork will pop off by itself. With lower carbonated beverages, low pressures, that is not the case. And you can get some very upset customers because you'll end up with corks that look like that, which, they're trying to push the top of the cork out, and you get a split in the cork, and then you're going to have people trying to get into that bottle with the corkscrew, and it's under pressure. Now you've got a safety issue. So, you got to be careful there. And that's where dialing in that CO2, dialing in that priming sugar, and understanding what sort of pressures you're going to be potentially dealing with, and mating that with a proper closure is super important, right? One of the biggest issues I see commonly in the industry is using one cork with one bottle, and they're not compatible, or crown caps or screw caps. And there is no one size fits all. You really have to do your research. Okay. So verify your specs with your manufacturer or your supplier. Also do some packaging trials. That's the best way to do it. Some beer corks and hoods may work. You just have to, again, marry the product with the packaging. It's really important. Screw caps. So yes, there are screw caps made for sparkling wine, and you can get them. One of the issues that people run into is, in order for the screw cap to retain pressure and retain gas, the liner is quite a bit thicker than a Sarin X or Sarin 10 liner. And so the capping head, the force necessary, and the adjustments on the tuck wheel as well as the threading wheel, you might have to make some adjustments to hit the right torque, so you have a good seal. So that goes with any screw cap. I don't care what salesman tells you what. Different suppliers, even in different batches with the same supplier, not all screw caps are created equal. You do have to be comfortable with making adjustments to the capping head. Otherwise, you'll get spinners, you'll get cut bridges, you'll get improper seals, you'll get leakers. There's a lot of things. Just like you have to make adjustments to the depth of the cork, and make sure a vacuum is pulled, and make sure the inside of the bottle diameter is correct, and you're doing everything there. There's still some adjustments that may need to be made with screw caps, regardless of liner or package. So I want to go ahead and dispel that myth, because I've seen it a million times when suppliers are like, oh yeah, you'll be able to use my caps and no adjustments and no problems. That is wrong, and that is deceitful in my opinion. So cans, really popular. There are some parameters that you need to take into consideration: alcohol content, the metal content, specifically copper. So if you're using any sort of copper to address sulfide issues, be careful of the residual. Copper is a really strong oxidative catalyst, so you need to be careful with that. And look at that total package oxygen, total dissolved oxygen. Those are very low numbers, and hopefully everyone in Iowa has a dissolved oxygen meter, but I kind of doubt that to be the case. You really should get one. It's one of the most important analytes to consider. It has a direct effect on your sulfur chemistry and what sort of expression they have, as well as your shelf life and how effective your SO2 adds are going to be. So it is, in my opinion, the most important thing to analyze. Recommendations insofar as chemistry: greater than 3 pH, because you don't want too acidic because it'll degrade that liner. Free SO2 less than 30, total SO2 less than 80. The only way you're going to achieve those numbers is by controlling your dissolved oxygen. Chlorides and tannic acid, that's a whole nother thing, but a really acidic product with a lot of SO2 is going to be problematic for cans. Tabletop canners are not recommended because they lose their adjustments and you'll get bad seams. So you got to be careful with that. For still products and even for some carbonated products, liquid nitrogen should be used for internal can pressure and rigidity, also to inert the headspace between the level of the wine and the top of the lid. You have to address that headspace, just like you have to address headspace in a tank. The same thing occurs in cans, kegs, bottles. It doesn't matter. You still have to address the headspace. And I would say, without a doubt, that headspace in a package is, by surface area, way more impactful on the shelf life of the wine than headspace in a tank. So corrosivity testing should be done. If you do lithographed printed cans, they're a little bit better than shrink sleeves for abrasion resistance, for on-package, on-premise, or on-shelf appearance. And with proper internal pressure, they can be stacked 2 pallets high. That is a brief overview of cans. I just wanted to touch on that. You should be very familiar, if you're using cans, with seam inspection. This is how you form your seal. Make sure you don't have leakers, you don't have oxidation issues. This is a cutaway of the lid and the body of the can, and it shows a proper seam. And so if you're using a mobile canner, they should be doing this on an hourly basis to make sure that everything is working just fine. If they are not, you're probably going to have some problems. There's some other QC things. Make sure you have a piercing gauge to identify the proper can pressure, because cans do require some internal pressure. Otherwise, they're spongy and they'll crush. Seam inspection, like I said, dissolved oxygen. I don't care if that's cans, kegs. At all points in the winemaking world after fermentation, you should be measuring and adjusting and controlling your dissolved oxygen. It gets more important the closer you get to packaging. And then weighing and fill heights. So just like you would have to do with bottles. So kegs. Great for buy the glass programs. I believe that kegs are the way of the future. There are stainless steel kegs like you see in this picture that you have to set up some sort of recycling program to get them back from the end user. Whereas there are some plastic single-use one-way kegs that can be recycled, so you don't have to have that loop set up. They do need to be gas pressure rated. Again, check with your supplier. With wine, because of its pH and its corrosivity, you do have to have different dispensing equipment than you would with beer. So beer, it's common to use brass fittings and things like that. I would not recommend that because you can get some problems associated with that and some corrosion. So stainless steel is preferred. And then I talked about the one-way versus the exchange kegs. So because exchange, you got the logistics of getting back and forth. Also, you have to deal with cleaning. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Again, here's my information. Between Two Buds, Black Dog Consulting, Piquette Posse. And then the Between Two Buds podcast, there's the email, there's the link for it right there, and you can find it on Buzzsprout at that 148-4671. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, everything else. But if you go to Buzzsprout, you can listen. It'll have links for whatever medium you like to get your podcast on. So that's about all I got. If there's questions, and there might be, hopefully I can address them.
Awesome. Thanks, Luke. That was great. Yes, I have one question so far. And please, anybody else that has questions, think of something you want to ask Luke and go ahead and type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand too, and I can unmute you, and then you can ask your question as well. But Martin P. had a question, and this was during when you were talking about Piquette. Do you ferment it with the skins or not, and how long?
You do. What I typically recommend is like a day, just to build some heat. Because once you build some heat in your fermentation, you'll actually extract almost everything you can out of the skins, and then you'd press it off during an active fermentation and let it finish off as a white wine. The reason you do that is because it's a really light styled beverage. If you do a standard 5-7 day maceration or an extended maceration, you're going to extract a lot more of those bitter and astringent compounds that are going to show themselves much more in this matrix than they would in a standard wine. So usually 24 to 48 hours is enough, and then you can press off.
Great. Dorothy asks, can we get a copy of your slides? Yes, Dorothy, I'm pretty sure you're going to have access to the recordings and the slides following the conference. But if you can't find them, let me know, Dorothy, and I will get them to you because I also have a copy. But you should be able to access that as part of being a conference participant. I had a thought too, and what was it? Oh, I think you referenced maybe something about TTB, Luke, but what are these classified as then with that low alcohol? Are they considered a cider, or they have their own classification, or what are they?
I want to be careful here.
Depends, huh?
I would say more than likely not. It's a formula wine.
Oh, okay.
I don't know that anybody is submitting a formula for the Piquettes. I mean, Pet Nat is sparkling, so it is what it is. But Piquette, in of itself, I would say is a table wine, depending on your alcohol. But I don't think the TTB even knows what Piquette is. I really don't. And I think people are getting away with it. And as long as you pay the taxes per gallon, I don't know that you'll see anybody, honestly. But they're going to have to address it eventually, because with the explosion of seltzer out there and the fact that wineries typically legally cannot ferment cane sugar, this is the best avenue that people can pursue to get something like a seltzer. And if you're trying to attract that, consumer that likes beer, which, I mean, Iowa, Midwest, I mean, that's the bulk of the consumers, having a Piquette on tap or in a bottle, I would suggest on tap as my first go about. I think it's just easier, safer. I think you're going to appeal to a much broader market. I think there's going to be an explosion of Piquette over the next couple of years. And of my former employer did not like my exuberance surrounding Piquette, but I think it's the way. I think everyone should try to do it and learn it, because the profit margins are great. It's an upcycled product. I mean, most people take their skins and they feed them to the cows or compost them, and here you have a product that you can make from them that is an answer to seltzer, and really high margin. It hits all of those, greenification, sustainability of America kind of things, right? You're getting two products out of one. So, and your margins are great. So definitely recommend that. Jenny had a question. I assume when you make Piquette, you're doing this in a separate space from the winery? Not necessarily. It's still wine. It's more susceptible to degradation, microbial spoilage. So I probably wouldn't ferment it in your barrel room, because your barrel room is going to have a much higher spoilage load than maybe some other places in your winery. I would be careful because it is a much more delicate product. So treating it like another wine is probably going to be problematic. So what was the target bricks for when to bottle? Well, it depends on what your goals are. For a Pet Nat, somewhere probably into the 3 to 4 bar range. So you're talking 12 to 15 grams per liter of fermentable sugar. With Piquette, I think you want a lower, so maybe 9 grams per liter, 8 grams per liter of residual sugar to hit a lower carbonation number. So it depends on if you're fermenting it to dryness, carbonating it, putting it in, or if you're going to do some sort of bottle conditioning. And a lot of that backs into what is your package capable of? Because you don't want to over pressurize something because it will blow up and it will be a problem.
So what I'm hearing is, if you want to try this style, it's definitely something you need to not just say, oh, let's try it and see what happens. You need to think through the whole thing before you try it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because even the application of the crown caps, let's say in Pet Nat, if you have the wrong applicator or if you have the wrong crown cap, like if you have a 26 millimeter bottle, a 29 millimeter cap, it might go on, but as soon as you get any pressure in it, everything's going to be leaking. So you have to know what sort of pressure you eventually want and back into that and make sure you have a proper package for it.
Gotcha.
But again, if you're doing a lower, okay, if you did a Pet Nat at 6 bar, which is standard sparkling wine pressures, and you have a lot of sediment in that bottle, it will gush and you will get basically nothing out of that bottle other than foam. So that's why people are typically shooting at lower carbonation numbers or lower pressure numbers to prevent that gushing.
Dorothy has a question about crown caps. What is the difference between beer and wine crown caps?
Wine crown caps are designed for higher pressure applications. Plus they fit different bottles.
Yeah.
And the tool needed to do the beer crown caps is pretty simple. I've got one in the garage. The wine crown caps take a much heavier duty, cost a couple $100, steel jaws, that sort of thing. So the size is different, the liners are different, the carbonation levels that they can withstand are different, the application is different. So if you're going to try to do this, I would, with Piquette, if you get the right crown cap, beer crown cap, it'd probably be fine. But again, you have to make sure it's going to fit the bottle you're going to use. And, it's not legal to put wine products in beer format, right? So you can't use a 12-ounce bottle. So if it gets sticky, I would recommend probably staying with wine crown caps and wine bottles, because there are beer bottles and there are wine bottles and they're different.
TGB did just change it, but maybe that was can size. They're allowing for 12-ounce, but is that only can, not bottle? Or it was just a mill format? I glanced over that TTB circular, but that's a good question.
Compliance is not my strong suit. And it's a legal nightmare, so I don't get into it. I'm like, yeah, there's people that can advise you on that. There's lawyers. That's what they're for. So
best not implicate yourself, right?
No recommendation there. Jenny had a question. Is there anyone doing Piquette with hybrid grapes around here? Yeah.
That one picture was a Chamberson, wasn't it?
That's Spence Style Winery out of Kansas City, Missouri. She's one of the early adopters of Piquette. Been doing it for a few years now. I think personally, hybrid grapes with their acidity is perfect for Pet Nat and Piquette. It really is. So that natural low acidity, or high acidity, low pH, if you got something that's 3 pH and you press everything off. One thing about pHs and pressing, if you've ever sat next to a press through the press cycles, the harder you press, the higher your pH climbs. Mm-hmm. So take that into account. But with the natural, like if I was in Texas and the pHs, I was going to make a Tempranillo Piquette and the pHs were 4.2, then things get really difficult. But with Marquette or some of these other hybrids that use commonly in the 3.2s, 3.1, and that's normal. The chemistry is on your side for making piquette, because your water wash, by the time you wash it, is going to be you're going to be closer to the 4, maybe 3.6 range than you would be with other climates. And I'd probably recommend RO water for this. That's probably what I would do.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, it is 3 o'clock on the dot, and I don't see any more questions. Oh, I see one more question. Okay, Aaron has one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. What about the skin integrity? Marquette has such thin skins that fall apart.
Yeah, you can probably end up with a goopy piquette mess. I mean, honestly, depends on if you're using pectinase or hemicellulases or any sort of enzymes to break down those skins. And you can also adjust this too on when you press in general, right? So if you want more sugar, you press off earlier, right? And white wines and rosés that get a fresh press right off the bat, they're going to have much higher sugar and acid content than a red wine that's been through fermentation on the skins and then you wash. So it's tricky. Piquette is tricky, but it can be great. I think you would get a pretty quick extraction out of Marquette with the thin skins. I don't know. I've never made piquette out of Marquette. So, are you making any additions like tannins to piquette? Well, most piquettes come out of the natural world, that's where the roulette thing comes in. They just wash it with sugar, and whatever they get's whatever they get. Coming from a large scale, commercially distributed, on the shelf presence kind of winemaking background, I'm going to use all the tools in my toolbox to make the most consistent, reliable, high quality wine there is, and to include tannins. Mm-hmm. So I do have a protocol that I have developed and people have used, and I kind of want to clean it up, but it's kind of like a best practices when considering piquette. So I'm happy to share that too.
Awesome. Great questions. Great presentation, Luke, as always. So thanks for sharing these old, new styles, I guess, because they've been around for some time, but they're kind of coming back into style, it looks like. Oh, Jenny says she would love that information when you have it done, Luke.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I think we're going to wrap up here. Let me see. If you check back through the chat box, there is a link to take a survey from your experience for the conference today. You can click that link quick and do that survey. Otherwise, you will also be emailed a copy as well. And then members, IWGA members, our annual meeting is going to be starting here in just a few minutes at 3:30 in Zoom room 1. And I believe an email just came out to the membership as well. So make sure you come back to Zoom room 1 for the annual meeting, followed by a little virtual toast to the industry. And with that, Luke, I will thank you and say goodbye.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Take care. Thanks.
Thanks.